Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse, Agile Leadership and Challenges in Digital Transformations. Our speakers today are Ronnie Ranga and Alan Brown, and I'm Lindsay Vellicina, and I'll be your host today. So can you please change slides? Okay, so some quick housekeeping items. Your microphones will be muted throughout, but we encourage questions. We're actually going to stop 3 times throughout the presentation for questions. So please, as soon as you have them, start typing them in. We'll get to as many as we can. Any that we can't get to, we will answer offline. As you can see, there's 2 places to type in questions. One is the questions box, and the other is the chat box. So please feel free to utilize those, and we look forward to some great interaction. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So very quick overview of Scrum.org. We were founded by Ken Schwaber, one of the co-creators of Scrum, and we offer Scrum training and certification around the world with around 300 professional Scrum trainers globally. Our classes are geared toward the roles in Scrum and also other topics, including leadership, scaling with Nexus, and using Scrum with Kanban as a complementary practice. We also have our PSU class, which teaches how to integrate UX designers into Scrum. So we have a wide variety. Feel free to go and check out the courses, as well as our certifications that we offer. With that, one other quick housekeeping note, just so everyone knows, the webinar is being recorded and it'll be distributed after the webinar and also up on social media and the Scrum.org website. So if there's something that you're furiously taking notes on, you'll be able to capture everything after the webinar. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Alan and Ron to get us started.
So, hello everybody. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Ronnie Ranga. I'm married, have 2 daughters, and I'm a professional Scrum trainer for Scrum.org for I think almost 6 years now. In the last 2 years, I was the course steward for the Agile Leadership class that we have at Scrum.org, which is called the PALE class. Loving that a lot, since there's a lot of information we can share around leadership development, which is also my role that I share on LinkedIn. I call myself Agile Leadership Development, which means that I help organizations to develop leadership in the broader sense of the organization. So that not only means management, but leadership on all levels in the organization. And I try to do that as an interim manager every once in a while to step inside the manager role and help people become self-organizing by making myself superfluous. So that's who I am. And then we have Alan. Let me change the slide so Alan can introduce himself.
Thanks a lot, Ron. So my name's Alan Brown. I'm currently a professor in digital economy at a university in the UK, the University of Exeter, and their business school. I'm also a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK National Institution for Research in AI and Data Science. So I've spent a lot of my time in industry over the last 20, 25 years, a lot of that in the United States, but some of that also in Europe, working with larger corporations and also doing some startup work myself as a software engineer, computer scientist. But also now more and more, I'm working with the larger organizations as they try to adopt digital technologies in new ways, drive their business models, look at new ways of trying to introduce more agility into their way of working. And most of what I'm doing is really coming in at the larger organizational level, trying to look at organizational structures, how learning and development is occurring inside those larger organizations, but also trying to adapt the agile development at the practitioner level to the management structures and the management approaches at the higher levels in the organization. So that's the position that I'm going to come into this conversation with.
Yeah, and Alan, you mentioned digital transformation already as author of the book, so probably going to the next slide, you'll probably have some information to share with us on what kind of challenges do you encounter when doing digital transformation?
Yeah, so when I'm talking with people, usually in executive levels or leadership levels, within particularly larger corporations of various kinds, Of course, they're enamored by the opportunities that new digital technologies bring. So a lot of the conversations we have about digital transformation inevitably begin with a conversation about digital technology. What is possible with the technologies? How are they being used? What kind of new activities do we see them being applied to? And we see this at many different levels, from drone technology to automation in the home, to retail technologies, through to wearable devices and many other things. So the conversations tend to range over a very wide area. And much of the conversation really is just trying to understand what that feasibility of that technology is. But if you switch to the next slide, Ron, what tends to happen fairly quickly is we end up in a conversation about three different things. We end up in a conversation that I think starts with a discussion on feasibility of the technology, but ends up very quickly saying, given I can do this with the technology, how would I make money out of that? Where's the new business model? What does it do to my existing way of charging and pricing? And then also quickly into the desirability. What do people want and how do they use it? How do we understand it? So if I give a simple example in the agricultural domain, I'm working with chemicals, agricultural food suppliers and pharmaceutical providers, farmers, people in the supply chain. And we take something where we see, for example, we see wearables on animals now, let's say on cows and pigs, where the wearables are being embedded or attached to the animal to understand the animal's health and behavior. It may be about the animal's physical health, it may be about its yield, it may be about its health, and looking at different markers about the animal in terms of its current state and well-being. The interesting thing is when you start to think about the implications of that, it's not simply we're driving efficiency from the food chain. We're starting to rethink the industry as a whole as to where information comes from, how it flows, and how it affects the business of, in this case, the farm to fork kind of journey. How has that changed? How is it redesigned? How is it adapted? Where does the way we say this often in the academic world is it sort of defines the value capture. So the question of who does what and who gets what is completely redefined. And that's the very fundamental change that's occurring. It's allowing us to start to think very differently, not just about we can gather data, we can move more quickly to test things out, we can put some things out into the marketplace that might have an immediate impact on what we're selling and how we're selling it. We're rethinking the market. We're redesigning who we work with and why we work with them. We're trying to understand where the value comes in the way in which we operate as an organization, what our position is in that value chain, and therefore all about how we interact with the businesses we work with, if it's a B2B, direct to the consumer, what they're trying to do, how we're going to compete and manage that market to be more effective from a strategic point of view. And that's a pretty fundamental change.
It's an interesting one. So could you give me an example? Especially, I was interested in that farms and the pigs and the cows example. Could you tell us how, for example, that would be different in a case like that?
Yeah, let me give you an example. So if we're working with a pharmaceutical company that provides pharmaceutical to animals, if you say to them, what's the role of the veterinarian? The answer used to be they fix sick animals. The answer now is they treat the wellness of animals. They ensure they don't get sick. They can predict, they can analyze, they can understand, both at the individual animal level, as well as at the herd level, and as well as at large population level, which means that the way they operate, the way they act, the way they interact with the pharmaceutical organization, with the farmer, with the farm suppliers, with the supply chain, is a completely different activity. And that changes, for example, who pays for what, how drugs are used, the impact on insurance, the way in which you look at the provenance of a piece of meat or the dairy produce that comes from an animal. All of those things are rethought. It's not simply about we can drive more efficiency from an animal, we can use more drugs in a certain way, or target the drugs more effectively. That's pretty substantial.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that must mean that the complexity of the system also goes up way faster because there's a lot of people involved in this, right?
Exactly. So if you flick to the next slide, Ron, you'll see
Yep.
that what tends to happen is we end up in 3 different conversations. One is about the digital technology itself, and a lot of that is about efficiency. Can I remove some of the human steps? Can I automate some of the steps? Can I remove some of the friction, that we might call it, between different steps in a process? But very soon we get into a conversation at the next level about services, and it's about value. Where is the value? Who gets the value? How do we capture and share that value? Do we need to rethink that? So, for example, if you start to introduce certain business models that might be to do with delayed payment, subscription models, outcome-based models, for example, when they get paid for the service they deliver, depends on a different kind of conversation and a different equation. And particularly when we get to this third level about organization and culture, you start to say, how do we incent people around the outcome, which is healthier animals, farms being run more effectively and efficiently, less runoff in the fields, more targeting of the drugs. And eventually, if you start to follow this, for example, with the pharmaceutical company in this example, they're asking a very fundamental question. How do I drive more value by selling less? That's really interesting. They sell less product, yet they drive more value to them and their supply chain and their ecosystem. How do they do that? By targeting more effectively, by reducing waste, by ensuring the efficiency and efficacy of the drug use. Wow, that's a really interesting thought. And if you start to think about that, the way in which our organizations are designed, for example, for selling more things, for driving up margins, for compensating sales and marketing people about the numbers of sales, that has to completely change. That's a revolution. That's a digital revolution right there.
So Alan, if you talk about digital revolution and the word revolution itself, right? I can imagine. I've been running around a lot of large-scale organizations for the last 12 years. I mean, I've seen some fairly large structures in organizations. This sounds like it completely rethinks the way that this organization is organized. So that probably will take some time or maybe some hassle to change that, right? Or what do you see
Correct.
there?
So if you flick to the next slide, Ron, you'll see that the kinds of questions that are being asked, and on the left are listed just some of the organizations that I've talked to recently and worked with. I'm sure you've got your own examples and their own companies that you've worked with. The kinds of questions they're asking and the implications for those organizations of those questions go far beyond software development, IoT devices, connected internet, use of the cloud. Of course, they depend on those things. All of those changes will depend on that, but within this broader context. And the point I'd like to try to make in this little sort of introductory section about digital transformation is those bigger questions are being asked across the organization, across industries, across ecosystems, and they're all driven by software development, design, teams working in an interdisciplinary way, focus on problems, redesign around the customer, all the kinds of things that we would say from an agile delivery perspective. But this broader context is beginning to dominate the conversation. It's beginning to have a huge impact on how and why these ideas of agility are being applied. And the organizations that I'm talking to about what does it mean to be an agile leader are trying to understand and assess how things like Scrum, agile thinking, the experiences and the successes they've had at an individual development and development team level can be reflected in these broader conversations where there are many, many unknowns.
So I'm wondering, all those clients that you just mentioned, and we don't have to go zoom in on one of them, but they are fairly large corporates in there. So how does that affect the way they are really structured? Are they actually changing their organization structure based on this?
They are, but not without a big challenge, as you,
Yeah.
I'm sure you know, and everybody knows on the call. They're trying to rethink what the shape of their corporation looks like, but they didn't get into the shape and into the structures that they're in right now in a very short period of time. It took a long period of time. They've got a lot of heritage and structural challenges that they're trying to address, but they are trying to reshape how they make decisions, how they organize themselves around some of the problems that they face, how they deliver capability, new features, new value to the clients that they face. But they're trying to do that often within the confines of trying to deliver on the promises they've made to existing customers, to their marketplace, to their shareholders, to the public as a whole. So they're trying to balance these two, sometimes by splitting themselves into very different chunks of the organization, sometimes by trying to move in a more incremental way.
Yeah. So that is a conversation, for example, that I also happen to see a lot in organizations. Do you think in the future, and that's a take that I have on this, that maybe these large-scale corporates will be more like smaller companies under the hood on one label or something like that, who are arranged completely different from each other?
I think that that's a likely scenario for certain organizations in certain situations. I think many organizations certainly value the size and the position that they have in marketplaces, and they're trying to see how they leverage that. Is being a large established heritage organization simply an anchor that weighs you down, that stops you from moving quickly into a market, or is it something that gives you a well-defined position, access to a history of what's happened in the marketplace, um, points that you can reach out to in every organization, and conversations you've had with key players that you can leverage? I think that conversation about where you sit in that is going on right now, and I think the answer to where people sit and how they're going to evolve depends a lot on how they see themselves in the market, what the competitors are doing around them, and their ability to move at speed and to redefine the kind of risk profile of how they're going to address that market.
So imagine that I'm a manager in this large corporate organization. What kind of advice would you give me to, be able to work with this new kind of organization that we're talking about?
Well, I think right now this is the conversation going on in most HR or learning and development kind of groups within these larger corporations. They're trying to reassess the skills that they need and the kind of thinking and operating environment in which they need to work. So they're looking at how do we introduce more design thinking so that we open ourselves up to new ways of working? How do we open up new channels of innovation to a broader constituency through open innovation, hackathons, bringing people in from the outside, and those sorts of ideas? How do we start to look at some of the lean kind of lean, agile and lean techniques that have been used now for the last 5 to 10 years? How do we learn from some of our software development and delivery teams that seem to have adopted a culture of agile delivery that's redefined the value proposition at the software level? Can we learn from that and see how far we can take that from a management point of view? There's those sorts of techniques that I think organizations are experimenting with, that they're at the heart of how they're going to face this future.
Okay, and how does that affect the digital transformation then at the end? Because digital is where you started with this.
I think the digital transformation is really the driving force for a lot of this change. It's being driven. For example, if I talk to most organizations about what's your digital strategy or your digital transformation strategy, it ends up one way or another with 3 chunks as defined in this slide. There's a first chunk, which is how do we open up so that we work more with clients? We don't just have the odd focus group every 3 months where we tell them things they already knew and hope to persuade them of what we're going to do. We actually interact with them in a much more intense, active way. We're transparent about what we do. We try to engage them in some of the conversations and decision making, and we try to take our ideas from a broader, more diverse constituency. They look at joining up, particularly across their internal silos. I think one of the things from the Agile movement that they're very envious about is the multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary nature of the way problems are solved. So they're looking to the lessons from the Agile community to how that might work. And of course, a lot of that is based around platforms and ecosystems. This kind of idea that there are central hubs of activity that bring together marketplaces, and we can take advantage of the multi-sided network nature of platforms, particularly based around some of the outcomes we're trying to achieve for the broader community. And then the final thing is the smartening up in terms of upskilling and reskilling our people with the right techniques and technologies. The way in which we apply efficiency. Often right now, the conversations I have deal with RPA, robotic process automation, and other sorts of things, which are simply automations of the current practices in general. But then also looking at how new technology will enable them to rethink how they solve problems in completely different ways than they did before, because of the data that's available, because of their ability to predict and anticipate and use the patterns of that data in order to drive change. So typically opening up, joining up, smartening up is my sort of shorthand for the advice that I give organizations, depending on their current maturity and situation.
So I can imagine, if you run this internally in your organization already, it can cause a lot of friction inside the system. But if you talk about opening up with clients, that also means that you're differently dealing with contracts. Did you have conversations with clients on that part?
Yeah. There's many conversations about contracts. So a good example is I've been working with a large company in the transportation sector that's trying to work with its client, which is one of the large rail networks, about outcome-based contracting. Can we switch to a contract that says, we give you our software for managing signaling on the railway system? You can have that for free. You pay us based on how much we reduce delay on the transportation network. Our software is intended to help you to reduce that delay. You pay us in proportion to how much we achieve that goal. Now, there's a contract being signed, but my personal view is I'm not sure either side quite understands what they've signed yet, because that kind of outcome-based conversation has been a goal for a long time. I think we're only now realizing that because of instrumentation and IoT and everything else, we can actually start to enact those from a technological point of view, but we're not quite sure what that means from a viability point of view. Have we hit the right targets? Have we hit the right sales practices? Have we got the right pricing? Have we got the right incentives for all of the players in those ecosystems? That, I think, will evolve quite quickly over the next few years.
So if I'm a person working at a legal department, being part of the value chain, I'm trying to picture myself in that position. What's my role in this whole value chain then? And how does that change compared to, previously?
I think this is really critical, and we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the problems that organizations face as they go through this transformation. But let me just summarize it by, we'll go to the details in a minute, but the summary is, I think the real challenge in these organizations is what I call a PM problem: project management, performance management, portfolio management, policy management. At that level, we're seeing huge issues right now, because at the software development and delivery level, there's quite well-defined and established techniques. There's a lot of experience, there are coaches, there are Scrum.org. There's lots of things that can be done. At the high-level management level, there's a lot of rethinking about new management styles for adhocracy and all of those sorts of things. In the middle is a real problem right now. Yes, there are some techniques. They're not well understood. They're not well applied. The practices aren't well defined. The incentive models, the understanding of how that works. And I think that's where a lot of the focus will be turned in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months.
Okay, cool. So I guess people listening, and also I got some signal from Lindsay that you have some interesting questions coming in. So maybe this is a good moment to switch to the next slide and answer some questions from people listening to the podcast.
This first question, if you could go back to slide 7, Gaurav is asking, in regards to the Venn diagram, where do people come into this diagram?
Interesting. Yeah.
Very good question. Nice, easy one to start with. I like that. Of course, all of these rely on people in very different ways. The challenge here, I think, is if a lot of what happens in organizations is they say, oh, I'm dealing with the people one because the desirability means that I do a few customer journeys and a couple of personas. And in fact, the last large organization I dealt with, when they sent me their personas, it was quite horrifying how naive they were and how focused they were on a very different view of what I think this interaction with clients, this understanding of people's activity was meant to be. So a lot of the focus is on that D in terms of people. And I have to say, somewhat naively, but I think people are beginning to grow their understanding, which is why, for example, quite a few organizations are beginning to employ ethnographers, anthropologists. They're starting to build a really strong base of what it means to understand how products and services are used by their clients in the marketplace. But people are all over this picture. In terms of the feasibility of the technology, the technical feasibility tends to be a socio-human issue as well as a pure technical issue. How that technology is used, how it's used in practice becomes really important. And in terms of the viability of the marketplace, the business models, if we just narrow it to that part of the viability, the business models that are being explored cannot be explored independently of what that business does to the individuals. For example, surge-based pricing and surge-based business models have a huge impact, I think, on individuals who are trying to achieve some service. And there's a very fine line between taking advantage of demand in a surge-based marketplace and actually discriminating against people. So there's a very interesting challenge here when you start to explore each of these.
Yeah, and I think to add to what you just mentioned, Alan, is that what I see a lot of the traditional organizations do, if you look at the three circles that you picture here, is you set up a backlog, you set up mechanisms, you set up a lot of structure and processes around this in the organization. And traditional organizations are quite used to do that part. But if you look at the people part, it also means having good conversations. How do you facilitate a conversation to move from we have a contract and we stick you to the contract instead of we're now collaborating with each other, right? So it also means how do you socially set up a structure in the organization that enables all three circles to flourish more, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And quite often, I tend to use this picture and then say, where do you think this falls down? Because this is a fairly traditional way of looking at innovation. And if you're not careful, it does end up being rather mechanistic. And I think that the comment and the question is a very strong one.
Yeah, so I think maybe in the next chapter where I'm going to talk about teams and people more, we might have some more elaborate answers to the people questions more, but it's a good question. We'll have to explore a little further later on. Are there any other questions, Lindsay, that you got in that might be interesting for us to have a look at?
Yes, so this question comes from Gabriel. So customers who have not started their digital transformation yet, how do you cope with those and get them started?
Well, I think I think all the organizations. Yeah, I think all the organizations I'm dealing with have some way along the digital transformation, even if it's very much about digital technology use. And in many cases, they're moving, for example, to do multi-channel, omni-channel kind of support for customer service, or they're trying to introduce technologies that will make their back office operations more effective. So typically when I'm asked, come in and have a conversation about digital transformation or digital technology use, my first question is in my head is where are they on that sort of 3-box chart of digital technology, digital services, and digital organization? What have they done in each of those areas? Typically there's more at the bottom and less at the top, but not always. And I try to map that out a little bit and say, not just, you have to do all of them, but to try to put a path together that says, what are they capable and what do they need in each of these areas in the coming 3, 6, 12, 24 months? And how can we start to create in a Scrum Agile kind of way? How can we create the right meaningful iterations around this, the sprints that we need in order to drive some value in short time-boxed iterations with the right kind of values around it that we can reflect upon? So we spend quite a lot of time trying to put those plans together.
And maybe to add to that, Alan, what I see happen if you talk about Scrum teams, for example, when you were using a sprint review in Scrum, who you invite at a sprint review? Do you have internal stakeholders in there, or do you actually invite the real customer of your product in there? I always tell them, like, create a candy store for the people who are not used to work in this way. They might be triggered by something that they can actually see and work with, to see that they're actually interacting now with the people doing the work, so that they can actually have influence on the value that's being created, right? So if you have a sprint review, invite the real customer over there instead only of internal stakeholders, because internal stakeholders are no real customers. They are just colleagues or maybe partners in this whole value chain. So create a candy store would probably also a good advice to use for this question. Yeah.
So I think we probably should move on, Ron, and because I'm interested to hear your view from the Agile leader's point of view. So why don't you pick up?
Yeah, so what I always tend to do is have a look at what's going on in the world in terms of agility. So there's this very interesting annual State of Agile report that is being hosted by version 1 every year. They do a survey, a worldwide survey, where they just look at what is going on with agility and leadership in many organizations. And we're going to zoom into the leadership part of this later on. What is interesting on this is that if you look at the statistics that they are producing, they're asking what is the adoption rate of agility in the world, just to have a view on how that is going. And in terms of adoption, 97% of the people filling in that survey say, yeah, in some way we are using agile development methods in our organization. So that my simple conclusion of at least that part of the survey is that agile has become the mainstream of developing products nowadays. What's more interesting about though is have a look at the maturity in there. So I need to explain this a little bit. So if you look at the maturity of agile in most of the teams, you can divide that in 5 levels of maturity, starting with not doing agile at all, or maybe considering just starting with that. So that's the organizations who are really at the starting point of using it, versus the level 5, where there's teams like doing it maybe already for 10 years, using agility, agile practices. Maybe they've been practicing Scrum for a long time already. And actually, as a result of that, they are becoming more responsive to market conditions. So if you look back to what Alan just talked about, opening up, joining up, smartening up, they've done that already before. That's what I would call a very mature team on level 5. So if you look at those maturity levels, and then you look at the survey that version 1 does, is what they actually find is that people, if they ask the people how much maturity do we have overall, 82% of those people say, yeah, we're somewhere in the still maturing level, either somewhere in between level 1 to level 3 of maturity. Only 80% say that they're at somewhere at level 4 or 5 in their organization. And this is a typical pattern that is not only pointed out by the survey that version 1 is doing. This is what also I have found while guiding teams from a management perspective in towards more mature teams, is that only like 18% of the teams actually break through that level 3 of maturity. And that is kind of interesting. So what is actually even more interesting, they've asked that same people who say like, okay, so there's 80% of maturity. Why are we not maturing? What are the reasons that we're not doing that? And if you look at the top 3 of reasons that that comes up with this survey, and this is actually being done for the last 13 years, and the result of that survey, at least for these questions, hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years. Most of the people say like organizational culture is not aligned with the agile values. If you look at the Agile Manifesto, general organizational resistance to change. So people resist change. And what they also say is like, we don't feel supported by our management in our efforts to become more agile in the organization. So to summarize that, if I look at the survey, to me, that would be a lack of leadership. So if you look at the maturity levels, I also have conversations with teams about this. And I think the best remark I got from a team once is like, we're hitting this glass ceiling over here. We want to mature, we want to go further, we want to get closer to our customers and talk about the digital transformation from the team perspective. But for some reason, there's this layer inside the organization that prevents us from actually making these bigger steps. And I think that's the area where I'm operating in as an interim manager or a leadership developer, is to help management in the organization set up an environment around teams where they can actually break through that glass ceiling, not in a revolution, but in an evolution, step-by-step approach, moving from level 1 to level 5. And I think that's why we created also a model, or and a model in any a model is wrong in any way, in the sense that this is just a reflection of what's really going on in many organizations. But what we've seen is that how a team operates at every level is actually influenced by how the leader operates. So if you talk about the Agile Leadership class, for example, that we teach from Scrum.org perspective, the class that we've developed, what we help people inside that class, so there's managers in there, there's Scrum Masters and product owners coming to the class, there's also CEOs coming to the class. We talk about how could you, as a leader who's used to helping people follow rules at the level 1, follow rules and instructions, and providing the rules and instructions, to a level 5 where the teams take the decisions themselves. They just need a greater goal from the management to move forward and do whatever is necessary to make that happen. Maybe they're directly in connection with the stakeholder or even the real customer. And of course, there's a big bridge in between level 1 and level 5. So how does a leader take a step-by-step empirical approach to move towards a higher level of leadership style? That is hard stuff. And it probably also means that leaders need to change the way that they act. And looking at that, what you typically see is that leaders move from a way of controlling stuff to letting go stuff, and that is not easy. Typically takes you 6 years to change your mindset like that. It also is about moving from being responsible yourself, feeling that responsibility intrinsically yourself, by having other people feel the same responsibility. So giving away the responsibility. It's moving from a reactive mindset to a creative mindset, where we actually, I think you also mentioned that, Alan, just before, where you need the upfront thinkers to think ahead instead of just react on what's going on currently. You need to be one step ahead, maybe even of the customer. It's about motivating the people it's about enabling the teams and instead of trying to motivate them. I think a lot of the people that I have met, at least inside Agile teams who are at the level 5, they were intrinsically motivated, and everybody probably is at the start. But once they get a lot of rules and a lot of structures around them, they kind of are disencouraged to step or stick their heads out of the mayfield and be one step ahead of everybody else. So that change of mindset from going from certainty to exploration and creativity, preventing mistakes to creating safety around teams so that they actually can make mistakes and learn from them, that is a very hard thing to do as a leader. And it takes a lot of practice and a lot of mistakes as well, probably, to move to a mindset like that.
So can I ask you a quick question, Ron? Because I'm in a situation right now where I'm trying to get a group of people to act more like a team.
Yeah.
And the resistance is both outside of the team, but it's also within the team. I think they're used to working in a different way. And I'm wondering, as that maturity happens, you've sort of expressed it as it's a problem outside. Do you see it as both a problem outside and inside, or is it predominantly outside of the team and they struggle? How do you see this?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. So imagine that you have been put in a situation for 20 years in a large corporate where you all were not supposed to step outside of the box, right? So that's what I typically see. People, they are acting within the boundary of that box and not, even thinking about stepping outside. So that's the internal problem that you often see. From the outside, I meet a lot of managers, or even as a manager myself, you see the struggle of how do I motivate those people who have been inside that box for 20 years now suddenly to step outside? What kind of skills do I need as a leader to convince them to step outside? If you really talk about leadership, that's a very different thing than management. To me, leadership is about people, and management is more about the things and the processes around it. So to come back to the question that we had before when you were answering it, is I think that is where the people part comes in. As managers, we need to rethink the way that we are dealing with people. Are we actually having the capabilities to really touch people on their hearts so that they actually make decisions intrinsically? I think that's the big challenge from the outside in. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm also interested in how you think it feels being in a more mature environment, or in your levels 4 and 5, than being in the group that you said were immature. How does it feel as a leader? How does it feel as a team player?
Yeah, so from a very practical point, let me give you an example. I have worked with many teams who were quite mature. There's been plenty around, but does that mean that all the other teams in the organization, or maybe the silos that haven't been touched by the agile transformation or the digital transformation yet, maybe they're still acting in a very traditional way? So on one side, it feels quite awesome to see a team act on a level 5 once you get there, once you actually as a leader also manage to get them at that position. But probably there's other teams not acting in a way like that, and they feel estranged, or they feel maybe even cheated because the other guys get more responsibilities, but while they aren't getting it. So why is that? What I typically see, it starts always, an agile transformation or a digital transformation starts 9 out of 10 times at the IT department. So what you typically see is that conversations will start happening on an HR level. Is like, why are these people getting so much freedom and we are not getting the freedom? These kind of conversations are going on quite often in an organization. So it feels, on one side, it feels quite awesome to see the change happen, but it also sometimes feels very frustrating as a leader to see how much time and effort it takes in a large-scale organization to have all these silos move over and understand what's going on. And it takes probably a lot of effort, and you need some thick skin to go through that. So frustration is probably the word that pops up most when I engage with leaders that I engage on a daily basis with.
Well, if you don't mind, let's open it up, Lindsay, and see if there's one or two questions that I'm sure Ron would be interested in taking a lead on.
Would be great.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for all these questions. There are a ton of questions here. We likely won't have time to get to all of them, but like I mentioned before, we'll be able to answer them offline. So this question is interesting, and it may affect several people on the line. So this question comes from Marcus, and he's asking how you see that portfolio management, development process, and operations best connect. They're having a challenge with that their development teams are arranged around products, but still the portfolio management process wants to have control as they had when working as a project organization. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, it's about how do you get people who work in different silos suddenly to have the same mindset? Is that a little bit the summary of what you just mentioned?
That is what I believe it is. If that's unclear, Marcus, please let us know, but that's what I get from this question.
So let's start with the operations part that you just mentioned, because I remember way back when we were still in a waterfall project. I was in a project actually that ran quite smoothly without we were even aware of that Scrum existed. And we had one or two people from the operations department working together with our team to deliver the stuff that we needed to do. So without knowing it, we were already very closely tied to what the customer wanted. So I think that is the most relevant question to ask, is like, how do we as a team have every discipline on board to actually answer all these questions in a fast way to see the value happen at the real customer? And I think the organizational structure is only there to support that people working together on a customer problem can make awesome things happen. I think that is the core why Scrum even started happening in the first place. So even that the fact that DevOps term has been invented, I think that's a signal that we're not mature yet at working together. So also working, for example, with marketing and sales departments, where there's really different languages being used in those silos. So it's like in a large corporate, you need to even start with aligning the language within the silos. And I think the best way to fix that problem is to always look at what is the stuff that we're trying to do from the customer perspective. A technique that I use a lot is a value stream map. So what is the value stream? And an organization typically is a network of value streams. So how does that network look like? And what is all of our role inside a team to make that value stream as effective as possible? I think if you look at it from that perspective, it doesn't really matter from what silo you're coming and what contribution you make to the product delivery. But I think that is the conversation to start with, even if you're not using Scrum or if you're doing Kanban or whatever you're doing. I think that's the conversation to have. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm also seeing, Ron, a more basic pooling of resources versus dedicated resources kind of discussion that still goes on in many organizations. And I think perhaps part of the conversation for this question is about some people in some of those roles seem to be more rewarded for that pooled approach to multiple problems as opposed to dedicated resource to solving a problem.
Yeah, and to add to that is that I think what we as leaders and managers need to realize is that many people in the organizations feel that they are really working in a complex environment. We as leaders or as managers might think that it's maybe simple or complicated, but that doesn't mean that the people who are doing the work have to feel the same way. Maybe we are very experienced in the organization, but the people inside the teams who may just recently joined the organization really feel like they're in chaos or in complexity. So if people are residing in complexity, the best way to deal with that situation is not to have an individual approach to solving problems, but gather in teams. If you put all these brightful minds together in a team and tap into that potential, There's so much good stuff that can happen. And I think we as leaders need to tap into that potential by changing the leadership style and looking at how can we make these people working together more into teams that actually maybe stay together for a longer time so they can actually become more predictive in the long term.
So maybe we can take one more, Lindsay.
Okay, sure. Let's see here. So
You're
this
looking for a hard one.
There's just so many, which is great. So this comes from Thabata. I hope I didn't butcher your name. One of the biggest challenges to implement Agile is also external parties and vendors that are involved in the development, which are not prepared to work in an Agile work environment, specifically talking about system development. So how would you recommend dealing with external factors like that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, actually. And I yesterday I was with a customer getting exactly that same question. So they had like external suppliers who were part or should be part at least of the delivery cycle and had taken a part in this. And the problem they often have is that they're not even aware why we are changing the organization, why we have this digital agile transformation going on. And well, it is a very simple principle that I'm using there, is that regardless if it's an external supplier or it's an internal colleague, at the end, only one thing counts. How can we gather up around the problem to solve problems for our real customers? And if you're a supplier in that, probably the term supplier even should move to more partnerships, because if you work in teams and tap into the creativity of the teams working together, the only really way to do it is to be actually a team. And if you work with external suppliers, my experience with this is this works really well. It can work provided that you really have a partnership. So that means if you're making contracts and fighting over contracts in terms of, you know, not letting go of the requirements and not making the timeline flexible enough to have conversations around it, it will become very difficult to work like that. So a partnership really would mean like, yeah, we all agree that we need a contract, but we all agree that the only reason that we have the contract is that there's a need behind the contract, and we should gather around that need instead of focusing on the contract itself.
I think that's a very good answer. The challenge I think I find in practice is the role of policy and contract management and other sorts of parts of the organization in those supplier style relationships tends to be somewhat dominant. And there's particularly in these systems engineering kind of areas where they're very costly projects, the consequences of delay and failure are pretty high. You have to be very careful. And I don't think that we've found, in the projects I'm in, we've found a compromise yet that works between the intellectual approach that you just described, which I believe is exactly right, and the contractual and boundary issues that typically happen in organizations. I see that all the time as being a challenge.
Yeah, true. So having said that, maybe it's good to wrap up some of the conversations we had already and just have a look at the paradoxes and the conflicts that we actually meet when we talk about leadership, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting, particularly from the broader management point of view. One of the ways that I've found to be most useful in conversations around these challenges is to try to face up to the paradoxes or the dilemmas or the challenges and say that there's a sort of rebalancing, just a new perspective. And these are phrases probably that you've heard before as well, about being comfortable with being uncomfortable. This idea of what do you do when there's more uncertainty in certain situations? How do you deal with uncertainty? And we know that for most uncertain situations, we have to be more like explorers than we are policy followers. So again, trying to expose where those difficulties are in terms of how far ahead we can really predict, what those predictions mean, what we'll do if things fall outside our normal comfort zone, and how we'll deal with those. And having those conversations is really important. But for many managers, that's a challenge for them, how they become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Similarly
Yeah,
with this idea of transparency as well, Ron, it's that idea of making things more transparent, even within your organization, where often, particularly larger corporations, there's a lot of internal politics.
yeah, true.
Particularly for people whose career lies with multiple positions inside a single organization. You're trying to deal with some of the inbuilt behaviors, let's put it politely, that tend to be negative, but are part of how careers have been built in those large corporations.
Yeah, indeed. And at the end, it all ties back into the HR system that the organization is using. Because if you are moving from, as a leader, for example, to step more into the background and be more of a water carrier or acting in the shadows, how does that affect the way that we are looking at compensation in the organization as well? And, you know, learning journeys, long-term learning journeys, what kind of skills would I need as a leader to actually be good at that stuff? Right?
Yeah, so one of the large organizations I worked for, everybody with the same job title ended up being stack ranked, meaning everybody across the whole organization with that job title was ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you were somewhere in that list. And the
Yeah.
way that happened is there was a conversation that happened once a year between these managers who said, essentially, somebody that you don't know is better than somebody I don't know based on criteria we haven't agreed on. And it becomes just a sort of who's got the biggest reputation. Therefore, I can put this person here and that person there. And that kind of heritage, even if it's not practiced, that's in people's memories. That's in people's DNA about that's the way the organization has worked. And people still believe that those sorts of things happen in management meetings. So that makes it very difficult when you're trying to change leadership behaviors in practice. And some of
Yeah,
these others are very similar.
On the other side, I see a lot of positive stuff as well going on, because I also see organizations where managers really realize that getting the best people on board that maybe even are better at the stuff that they're doing than you are actually helps the organization forward, and are using that to transform the way that they're doing HR as well. So there are some good examples out there that actually work with that. So I have good hopes that we're moving in the right direction with it.
I think a lot of it is about, as you mentioned, the balance of moving towards those right behaviors with the right support structures, with the right incentive structures, with the right openness and conversations going on at all levels in the organization. And that synchronization has to be the key. And that where that doesn't exist, I find the most tension in an organization.
Yeah, and I think a good question to ask yourself, and I think this pops up every training class and every conversation that I'm having with my clients as well, is that if you want to really use teams as the basis of your success in the organization, ask yourself as a leadership team, how are you acting as a team? What kind of example behavior can you radiate towards those teams that they actually learn from your mistakes as well?
Yeah, maybe you can flip to the next slide, because as the summary, there was an HBR article, Harvard Business Review article, not very long ago, entitled "The Company Cultures That Help or Hinder Digital Transformation," and the conclusion was essentially these bullets: slow or stalled decision making because of internal politics, inability to prove the business value using traditional approaches, too much focus on the technology rather than the deeper people issues, lack of understanding of the operation issues at going from theory to practice, the real detail, and the fear of losing control by management. And I think almost everybody I talk to says, yep, they're the ones. I don't think there's any magic in that list. The difficulty is these are all about people. These are all about the difficulties that people have inside these complex organizations. And that is what makes these challenging. So again, no magic here, but that summary I think is very clear. And having open conversations about these hindrances is really important inside those organizations.
So
and maybe
then,
we just, yep, after you.
So then probably to wrap this up, we'll go to some lessons and the next steps. If you talk about digital transformation, which is your expertise, Alan, how would you summarize it then, based on this slide?
Well, I think we are seeing this move from digitizing, using digital technology to drive efficiency, to new ways of working as a result of these digital changes, new ways of thinking, new ways of operating. But that's been enabled by this rethink of value creation, value sharing. So most of the conversations I have in an organization that's saying, how do we use digital technology more effectively? Where does Agile fit in? I get to conversations about where do you think the value is in what you're doing? Who gets that value? When do they get that value? How is that shared? Who do you need to help to accelerate the creation and use and adoption of that value? And that's true both in commercial and in non-commercial, in government and third sector organizations. And that's a shift in the risk profile, how managers see the risk of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and how they look at that risk and manage that risk. And as I say, traditional engineering organizations, for example, with their risk registers and their auditing and their governance, manage risk in a certain way. What happens when that risk profile shifts is really important.
Yeah, and I think to the last part, so reassessing the current management techniques, even the leadership styles you're using ties perfectly into the first bullet under Agile Leadership. Is like, if your teams are maturing, realize as a leader that you might be one step ahead of the teams always, because if you're not, stuff is going to happen to you in the organization. I've seen so many members in teams that were working like this for 6 years already, where managers were lacking behind it, and the friction started happening in the system. So make sure as a leader that you continuously engage with the teams, but you also engage with yourself in a journey to maybe learn more about coaching, learn more about how to motivate people, and always be one step ahead of the teams when they're becoming more mature. What is your leadership approach to deal with that? And I think it's indeed also, and I think the last bullet is one of the most important ones. Yes, techniques and tools and processes are important. You need to have that stuff in place, otherwise there's no solid basis. But at the end, this is all people work. So if you look at the values in the Scrum Guide, and if you look about the left-hand side of the Agile Manifesto, it is all about people. It is about helping people to get the best version out of themselves out there. And you need some really good knowledge on that part, probably as a leader, to help people to focus on behaviors and not just on techniques. So that would be probably the lessons in the next set from our part. I think there's still a few minutes left, Lindsay, to maybe answer one more question.
Yeah, I think we can do one more question here. So this question kind of reflects back on the maturity levels that you talked about, Ron, earlier in the presentation. This question comes from Leah. What's the best strategy for an organization seeking to improve their level of maturity within Agile?
Sorry, say again, I missed that one.
What's the best strategy for an organization seeking to improve their level of maturity within Agile?
Yeah, I think the best strategy is not wanting to move immediately from level 1 to level 5, because that creates a lot of frustration. I think the best strategy is to make yourself aware of the company culture. So what is the culture? And there's ways actually to measure that stuff. So what is the culture that is in your organization? Make yourself aware of that stuff, and then start realizing how fast could we grow to a next level. Maybe not to level 5 yet, but just let's discuss openly with each other, together with the teams, but also with the management in one table. How could we make that next step? What would be the environmental changes we need to do so people are being invited to change their mindset a little bit instead of just moving completely evolutionary, right? I think that's the best takeaway I would like to give people. Have patience and be resilient.
I think that's great advice. So I think we're going to have to start wrapping this up here. Like I mentioned before, we will answer any questions offline once we close here. So if you can go to the next slide, Ron. Just a reminder for everybody that we do have digital learning paths on the Scrum.org website, so feel free to go and check those out. We're always encouraging you to continue your learning. We have learning paths for the different roles in Scrum, and we also have a leadership learning path. So please go and check those out. And next slide.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, a Scrum Master and a product owner also is a leader. So those implement those.
Right. Right. And with that, we'd like to thank you. Please stay connected with us. Post the webinar via social media and our forums and our blog. And very special thanks to Alan and Ron for coming and having this great discussion with us today. Hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.